It's time now for perspective, and we're going to stay with our top story today, the opening of that massive 9-month-long terror trial here in Paris, following the multiple coordinated terror attacks of the 13th of November 2015. My guest today is Yan St-Pierre, counter-terrorism advisor and CEO of the Modern Security Consulting Group. Thank you so much for being with us here on France 24 today. Now, we are almost 6 years on from the 13th of November 2015. What's changed between then and now as far as the terrorist threat here in Europe is concerned?
Well, the terrorist threat evolved in terms of it's become more various. We're no longer focusing mainly on what Islamic terrorism could do. We've seen an uprising or an increase of far-right terrorism. We've seen an increase in other types of extremism across Europe, which has diversified that threat, and it's also created further problems for security forces. We've also seen that the IS has lost a lot of its traction. We've seen an increase of, for example, in terms of so-called lone wolf attacks or single attackers, but we haven't seen a lot of those broadly planned major operations such as the one in 2015. And this is one of the biggest changes. It's definitely due in part to the new measures that were put in place since 2015.
So the nature of the threat is different, but as far as prevention goes, is there anything that French security services and intelligence services are doing differently compared to 2015?
The laws have changed. We're talking about a country that was essentially had a state of exception in terms of rule of law for a few years. A lot of these exceptional rules were integrated into law, were made into common law very recently. And therefore, the powers that were given to security forces in terms of prevention, in terms of data collection, surveillance, prevention, all of these elements combined, that has changed the landscape for France, which remains very unique in terms of the European perspective. Other European countries have a bit more restrictive laws in terms of surveillance, for example, and data mining. France, on the other hand, has really said, no, we need to be more to the forefront. We need to be more proactive. And this probably has been the biggest change that we've seen over the last 6 years.
Now, the criminal trial opening here in Paris today is not charged with looking into whether or not there were any security failings on the 13th of November 2015. Is that possibly a missed opportunity?
No, I think those two things need to be separated. First, the trial that starts today is about closure. It's about better understanding how could this have happened in terms of from the terrorist perspective, but also for the families of the victims to understand, finally put a face, finally get a sense of justice, because that's one of the biggest things is that when we deal with victims of terrorism, there's very often this sense of void because there's no sense of justice. In terms of the failings, this is more of an internal inquiry, but it's also political inquiry. This is really something that needs to be dealt with more openly in terms of transparency. And in that sense, it's a very different aspect, but it needs to be dealt with the same seriousness and diligence as a trial.
And we have been talking about the attacks of that night for the past almost 6 years. Are we expecting to learn anything concrete, anything new over the next 9 months in terms of what happened, how it happened? Is that the point of this trial, or is it more of an exercise in catharsis?
It's not really an exercise in catharsis, but I don't think we'll see anything new. I think what a lot of people are looking for is what's going to be Salah Abdeslam's story. He's changed his story a few times over the last few years, especially since his detention. I was mentioning earlier about closure, and I think this is what people are really looking for is, okay, can we finally condemn someone for those attacks? 20 people on trial, 6 of them presumed dead. 14 others related to the network, but one that was actually involved in the attacks. And I think the focus is really to provide a sense that finally we're bringing someone to trial. There will be justice is expected to be served 6 years after the fact. And this is the main focus of this trial. The information journalists and other actors have delved into this so much over the last few years that I don't think we'll see anything new.
Now, of course, in just a few days' time, the US is going to mark 20 years since the 9/11 attacks, at a time when the Taliban is forming a new interim government in Afghanistan. How concerned are you that Afghanistan will, under the Taliban, once again become a haven for terrorist groups?
It's very difficult to say because there are two different aspects. One is that region as a whole is very open. We focus on Afghanistan, but Pakistan has its issues. Iran has its issues with terrorism. We're talking about a trans-regional network that is very active. It's already conducive for terrorism and terrorist groups. The Taliban have learned from their mistakes as well. And in this sense, what happened 20 years ago, to be so open, to be so welcoming, supportive of terrorists, whether it's with Al-Qaeda or maybe other groups. And now 20 years later, they understand that if they're going to avoid another NATO operation in Afghanistan and other reprisals from the United States, that they will need to, at least publicly, monitor their actions and be more firm on terrorism. I think we're already seeing this, at least publicly, in terms of the cooperation, the possible cooperation with the United States against ISIS. I think this is an indication that we're going to see the vulnerability on two levels, one that's very political and public from the Taliban, and one that's internal and actually geographic and regionally based.
Yan St-Pierre, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Yan St-Pierre, counter-terrorism advisor and CEO of the Modern Security Consulting Group. Thank you very much.